My name is Greg Whyte. I am here as a PhD candidate from Asbury Theological Seminary, and I'm here, I guess, representing my discipline of missiology. And so I'm actually presenting Understanding Hell Missiologically through an honor and shame lens. So that's what we're going to be exploring today. To start off, though, I guess I'll give a few introductory remarks, just so you guys know a little bit more about me in that sense. First of all, my journey towards, I am a conditionalist, by the way. My journey towards conditionalism actually started on a flight from India to Singapore. My seatmate was a Hindu evangelist, and he actually asked me to share what I believe as a Christian, and I did the best that I could, given the previous teaching that I had received. His reaction shocked me, though, because after I'd finished all of this, he said, "Wow, that's great. We believe the exact same thing. We also believe that this world is of no value, and that our eternal and immortal souls will continue on living even after we're gone, and that there is a God who doesn't really care about what happens in this physical universe." This actually caused a check in my spirit where I started to ask, okay, did I properly represent Christianity here? Or was I just merely spouting the things that I had heard? Now, prior to this encounter, even though I had other matters that I was considering, I already kind of had some issues with what I would have shared, but this kind of brought it forward again. Now, during this time, I was on a sabbatical from my master's degree. I was teaching English in South Korea for 2 years, and then at the end of which, I returned back to Canada, and I went back to my seminary, Tyndale Seminary in Toronto, and I ended up sitting under Victor Shepard in his systematic theology class. And in that class, he basically said, you know what, the viewpoint that makes the most sense biblically is conditional immortality. And then at the same time, I ended up sitting and having amazing conversations with another professor who was there as a visiting professor named Howard Snyder, who was visiting for a couple of years from Asbury, which is where I am now about 10 years later. And yeah, through our conversations, he also recommended that I would read N.T. Wright's Surprised by Hope, which actually helped in many ways to build my at least understanding in new creation and resurrection. But then once I had that, then suddenly this other stuff didn't really make very much sense either. So I then delved into personal Bible study in English, admittedly, because I'm not a languages guy. By the end of that, I came out as cautiously as a conditionalist. I did keep it hidden and secret because, well, once I got involved and employed by a church as a pastor, that was one of those doctrinal things that they considered an essential, that you do not go against. Eternal conscious torment, you do not contradict this. And so I kept it secret until another issue came up that was completely unrelated, and I actually challenged the denomination on that, and their response was basically to strip me of the provisional ordination that I had, and that kind of was one of several ingredients that led to my no longer being a pastor. So yeah, that's kind of where I am. So in a way, I would kind of fit as a case study or as an example in Mark's session, which is happening upstairs and over on the other side of the building. But I'm not just here as a fellow conditionalist. I'm also a missiologist and a historical theologian, which, as Chris mentioned in his most recent podcast, this is very different from what the conference is usually used to hearing about. I admit that I'm not a language expert, and I'm not a systematic theologian nor a philosopher in the classic sense of someone who studied philosophy and the apologetics and whatnot. But rather, my discipline, which is missiology, is one that reminds the church of its mission to bring the gospel to the world, and to translate the message into terms that resonate and that can be understood by our audience wherever it is that we find ourselves. It's not just about going to other places around the world, although that is definitely included in the discipline, but it's more in exegeting our situation and our context, whereas much of what you may be used to is exegeting the text, which is one side of a bridge. Missiology is the other side of the bridge, where we are exegeting our situation, where we are at. I'm not sure if you guys noticed, but along the hallway here, there's signs and posters of what this church stands for. And a lot of those signs and posters, that's what missiology is all about. It's reaching the world and explaining the gospel in a way that they would understand. Sorry, I just lost where I was. So this is not only in addressing the questions around where we are at right now, but this also affects how we understand the Bible and also how we understand theology and history as well, where there is a world that exists in the background of the text. Much of the New Testament is letters. Letters were written to specific situations. Missiologists, as we approach the scripture, are asking what were those situations that would cause for the letter to be written. And also, in the same way, when theology would be developed at different points in history, this is kind of where it relates in with where I'm also as a historical theologian. What were the circumstances that led to the creation of the theology that was developed at certain points in history? So, why am I presenting on honor shame specifically? I'm not mentioning it to be exclusive of other culture types, but rather it is a case study and as an example of why we need to understand culture. It is also the worldview. You guys heard all about worldview this morning. It's the worldview of the world's majority, and it is often overlooked by much of Western theology. Take a look at any systematic theology book, or systematic theology textbook, or dictionary of theology. Look for how many times sin is something bad that you do where you are breaking the law or where you're not quite getting there, and it's something specifically that you are not getting there. Take a look at how many times guilt or God's judgment upon the bad things that we've done is mentioned within systematic theology. There's pages upon pages. What about the shame that sin brings? How much reference do you see to that? Very little. Anyway, that's what we're going to be exploring today. Specifically, I'm going to be using honor shame as a scaffold to understand then how can we understand hell as we're presenting the gospel into an honor shame cultural context. So first of all, we are going to be addressing, well, what does honor shame mean? What does it look like? And then we will add hell into the mix. So, to start us all off, how do we understand honor and shame cultures? Well, first of all, we need to understand what we mean by culture. Anthropologists define culture as the shared meanings and values and behaviors and attitudes and beliefs of a particular group of people that are expressed through the religion, the art, the food, the festivals, the fashion, the social institutions. There's the stuff that we can see up here, that is how it is expressed. There's also a lot of the stuff down here, like worldview and values and beliefs and attitudes, which you don't really see as well. And so because of that, there have been several metaphors that have been used to describe culture. It is multi-layered, similar to an onion. As you peel off the outside layers, you see more layers inside, and more layers and more layers and more layers. But also, some aspects of culture are more apparent than others, similar to an iceberg like what I have in the picture here. But at the same time, culture is also highly variable, and it also changes through time, much like what you would see with a river. You could track a river from one end of the river to the other, and you'll see that there are changes that happen along the way. Or even if you look at one particular place and you study that one particular location over a certain span of time, and you'll see that that particular place has been changed by that river. And even the river itself has been changed. So culture has been referred to in some of those senses. But what about honor and shame? What do we mean when we're talking about that? Well, psychologically, if we were to contrast guilt to shame, guilt is I did something wrong. There is an objective basis of a standard, whether it's rules or a law or an expectation, and you don't meet it, or you've broken a rule. The guilt is the, oh no, I just made a mistake. I didn't do this right. Shame, on the other hand, instead of I did something wrong, I am something wrong. There's something wrong with me. I don't belong. I'm an outsider. And innocence and honor are the opposites that are typically given to the guilt and the shame. Innocence, both you didn't do the wrong, or you may have done the wrong, but it has been paid for already, which is kind of the atonement theology that we generally tend to believe as evangelicals. Honor is the lifting of the face. It is giving dignity. It is giving worth and value to the one who is shamed. And so you can see that these two play as opposites to one another. So why is it that I'm talking about honor and shame-based cultures? Well, as an anthropological concept, these are a few anthropologists that have brought up the idea of different cultures having different personalities. So I guess you could call them cultural personalities where the majority of the people function according to different ways of life. And so you've got Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, and Eugene Nida. And they would define these cultural types, and they would differentiate between guilt and innocence-based cultures, honor-shame-based cultures, and then eventually there'd also be fear and power-based cultures, purity and pollution-based cultures, and there's actually a whole list of them that are defined in that way. And missiologists, because missiology takes theology and has it in conversation with the social sciences instead of in conversation with philosophy, and it asks the question, okay, how can we then communicate the gospel into these other cultural contexts? And so, since we are talking about honor and shame, as it is contrasted with the guilt and innocence, we need to try to figure out, okay, how are these cultures different from one another so we can define what we're talking about? Well, for one, the concept of sin. This is actually one of the biggest misunderstandings that missionaries have in going into honor and shame-based cultures. They would say that these people are immoral. They don't have a concept of sin in their language. They don't follow the rules. They tend to butt in line. They tend to cheat and go around. There tends to be corruption that is there and paying off people to try to become an exception to the rule. And so, but at the same time, there is a conception of sin. It's just that they understand it a little bit differently. See, in the West, we understand sin as breaking objective rules and laws. We have this sense of justice and fairness, this sense of you missed the mark, or you did not do good enough, or you broke this rule and therefore you should be punished. But in shame and honor-based cultures, sin is a betrayal or a violation of the relationship. and in the community. So in some of those cultures where family is seen as absolutely important, if someone were to break off from that culture or to break family relations for the sake of coming to faith in Christianity, that is actually seen as a sin because they've just broken relationships within their community. Also in some other places, hospitality is seen as the ultimate virtue. Where if you can lie to the cows come home, but if you fail to be a good host, then you are the worst of sinners. Secondly, guilt and innocence-based cultures are generally highly individualistic. It's all about me, myself, and I. Don't believe me? Listen to contemporary Christian music. I surrender all. God loves me. I love you, Lord. I am, etc., etc., etc. We're also very egalitarian in our relationships. I mean, we can sit and we can have chats and conversations and stuff, and we don't really mind about it. But if you go to certain honor-shame-based contexts and they find out, hey, you've got a doctorate, you're a doctor, therefore I must talk to you in a certain way. Or in Eastern Asia, for example, in Korea and Japan, which are the contexts that I'm studying for my dissertation, one of the first questions they will ask you is, how old are you? That's not to try to insult you, but it's more, how do I relate to you? Because the grammar of how I talk to you changes based on whether you are older than me, you're the same age as me, or you are younger than me. And if your social rank is higher or lower than me. It's kind of written into the language. Third, guilt and innocence-based cultures generally are more direct in our communication and in our speech. And we also tend to be what is referred to as low context. We say what we say and what we mean, and we spell it out. We spell it out in exactly written contracts, where we say everything that is involved with that contract. Shame and honor-based societies, they prefer more indirect speech, so as not to offend the relationship. They're also very high context, which basically means that they rely more on the context around them than on the specific words that are spoken. They would read more into the tone or into gestures. For example, if you were to go into a Middle Eastern context, you right now are insulting Chris. Why? Because your foot, the bottom of your foot, is pointing towards him. See, as guilt innocence people, we don't think of that.
You knew that. You're doing that.
But no, there's actually a very funny picture. I think it was when Clinton was the president of the United States, and he went and you had, I think it was Yasser Arafat and Benjamin Netanyahu, and they're signing this peace agreement, but both of them are sitting and their bottom of their feet are pointing towards each other. Now we think, hey, they're signing a peace agreement, they're at peace. No. Also, one of the wedding gifts that my wife and I got was a pair of wooden ducks. Now, in a Korean home, those wooden ducks, when they're received as a wedding gift, you place them on like a mantle or some other prominent place. And when things are going well with the marriage, the beaks of the ducks are touching, they're kissing. But when there's a problem, you turn the duck around. Now, for us, when we walk into the room, it's like, hey, yeah, what a nice home, this is really cool. But when they see that, and so because of that, there's a lot more of reading into what is said and communicated, and, well, did they really mean this, or did they really mean something else? And so there is definite difference there. And finally, guilt innocence-based cultures are task-oriented, and we focus on chronological time. If an assignment is due, or if a meeting is happening at 6 o'clock on Friday evening, you better make sure that you get it in on time and that you are there for the meeting. Shame honor-based cultures? Someone may show up 30 or 45 minutes late and there's no problem. Or they may hang around for an additional 2 hours after the event is finished because they want to get to know you. And also, there is a hesitancy to set up precise and specific meeting or scheduling times, because how can you put a schedule on a relationship? We want to get to know you first before getting down to the business. So you see, already there is a very distinct difference in culture that we're dealing with here. So now here's the fun part. We've got cancel culture, which is a form of mass ostracism and shaming of individuals for behavior or beliefs that are deemed as unacceptable by the crowd that is doing the canceling. It is used as a means of expressing disapproval, exerting social pressure, and using the offender, those who are canceled, as an example for others not to do the same thing that that person just did. Now, I put an asterisk by individuals because it's not always individuals. Sometimes it's entire groups of people. A very recent example of that, sorry if this is a bit too political, but the unvaccinated. Think about what happened with them. That is an example of cancel culture right there. Now, as a term, cancel culture, it's actually, even though the practice of canceling people, that is not new. The term itself is. The first time that it was kind of mentioned was a 1981 song by a band named Chick. And the song was called Your Love Is Cancelled. Now in 1991, which is about 10 years later, Wesley Snipes' character in this movie, New Jack City, basically refers to one of his hitmen and says, cancel, referring to his ex-girlfriend. That would get a nod from Lil Wayne in 2010 in his song, I'm Single. And then we have, especially with social media, you've got the Me Too movement, you've got Black Lives Matter, you've got online cancellation that is going on, you've got all of this stuff that is happening where you're seeing people starting to use cancellation, but cancellation as a term is from 2019, is when you first start to see it being used in mass media publications. And it's kind of been used ever since to describe this as what has been going on. So the question, is cancel culture an example of honor and shame in the West? The short answer is yes and no. On the yes side, it does use shame and social pressure on individuals to keep in line with the standards of the larger group. And it is also true that it is based on collectivist and mob conceptions of morality, which can often shift with attitudes of the time, as opposed to an inner locus of morality or an objective standard of morality. The third, the result of cancel culture is a social death and exclusion of the offender from the group. And in some cases, the cultural value is lost and careers sometimes are even ended, as people would make calls and say, hey, you need to fire this guy because he just said something that was really not so great. Or let's just spam his personal social media account with a whole bunch of attacks and garbage, just to try to intimidate him or her. And then as well as that, you can also see an increase of importance of image and reputation, which is something else from the honor and shame, which is also important, which I didn't mention back then as well. At the same time, though, traditional honor and shame cultures place emphasis on relationships and also on the community. Cancel culture relies on the anonymity of the mob that is canceling the offender. That is one very distinct difference. Second, there is no group honor lost, nor is there collective group identity for the offended, namely those who are actively doing the canceling. Now, this being said, there is an increase in tribalism today, which may be or maybe not dependent or independent on this cancel culture as a phenomenon. I'm not really sure how much connection there is with that, but there does not seem to be collective group honor that is lost when there is cancellation that is going on. Third, public shaming is not a new phenomenon even in Western societies. I mean, if you look far enough back, you've got the stocks and the pillories, which basically you either have your feet trapped in iron or you have your hands and your head put through a board and then people throw rotten fruit at you. Or you also have the uniforms of shame, such as what the Jewish people had to wear in pre-World War II Nazi Germany, or dunce caps, which are basically long pointed hats that kids used to have to wear in school. Basically, you just failed this test or you were misbehaving, therefore you need to sit in the seat of shame up at the front or at the back of the room and wear this hat for the rest of the day, basically saying, I'm an idiot. And then, of course, for anyone who has gone through the public school system, particularly middle school or high school, that is the height of honor and shame culture within our context. Now, one could argue that what we're seeing with both this new tribalism and with cancel culture, if you were to put them together, is actually an extension of a toxic middle school culture being brought out into the mainstream of society. One could make an argument that that is the case. But finally, there are other cultural values of guilt, innocence, and honor, shame that are not shifting. As I mentioned before, we are still very individualistic. We are still very much based on chronological time. We're still task-oriented. Just for a few examples. So let's add hell into the mix now. But first, a few considerations. I mentioned before how missiology reminds theology to address the questions of the culture around it. And this topic, the question of final destiny, is one of those questions that is being asked in our culture. Maybe, if not, what is hell like, but more the opposite. We want eternal life. We want immortality. How can we define that? How can we figure that out? Now, I mention this for at least three reasons. First, like myself, many Christians have a general confusion about eschatology in general, including the topic of final destiny. Well, it may be true, as what has been said from the stage, that at the scholarship level there is a general belief in resurrection and new creation. But at the level of the pew, and I would argue at the level of the pulpit, and at the level of popular Christian media, popular Christian books, perhaps even at the level of denominational policy, the general belief is that at death, your soul, which is immortal by its very nature, goes to either a spiritual, not physical, place called heaven, or hev, according to our hymns and our songs, or to the other place, hell, depending on what you believe or how you live your life. And this shabby and broken and worthless world is left behind, and wherever your soul ends up, whether the good place or the bad place, that's where you end up forever and ever and ever and ever. Don't believe me? Go to a funeral. What is the message that is being preached at a funeral? Listen to the average Christian worship song. Earth is not my home. I'm just passing through, going off to heaven somewhere. I'll fly away, oh glory, I'll fly away.
Going up to the Spirit in the sky.
Going up to the Spirit in the sky, exactly. Each of these kind of, well, and then of course, think about how often resurrection is even mentioned outside of Easter Sunday. And even when you're thinking about resurrection, how often is resurrection expanded beyond just, this is what Jesus went through? And then, of course, when you add other problematic doctrines like the rapture into the mix, that just gets into it even more of a confused muddle. So that's why conversations like this are important. Second, while it may have been true in the 18th century that there was limited access to other religious worldviews for the average Christian theologian, we can't say this anymore. Within our neighborhoods, and within our world, our conversation partners are not just the atheists or the deists, but intelligent practitioners of other faiths. Now, while this would be an interesting side topic, maybe as another topic that I can discuss at a future time, or someone else can take it up at some point, how is hell handled in other world religions? For the sake of curiosity, Islam teaches eternal conscious torment. With, of course, occasional times when Allah may look down and say, hey, I like you, come up to paradise, or I don't like your face, get out of paradise, get down to hell, just because he feels like it. Certain forms of Buddhism teach universalism, or a form of universalism which actually sounds a lot like annihilation as the ultimate salvation. Hinduism teaches about a purgatory where you exist between lives. Confucianism, if you do not do proper filial piety, then your name could be X'd out and you will not be remembered, therefore you will not live forever, because you live on forever through the memories of your descendants. And this is just scratching the surface of a few of the major religions and worldviews. But there's at least one more reason why understanding honor and shame is important for our conversation, and that's this. The Bible was written in honor and shame cultural contexts. Don't believe me? Well, here's just a sampling of a few biblical themes that speak to the honor and shame worldview. God's reputation. Humans being image bearers. Sin as being a betrayal and a violation of the relationship, which result in a loss of status or a loss of face. Slavery, exile, and death as consequences for sin. The shame of the crucifixion versus the glory of the resurrection. The entire idea of redemption with the kinsman redeemer. The narrative that you see in Ruth, that you also see played out in not so great ways in some of Jesus' parables. I mean, the parable of the prodigal son. The older brother was supposed to be the kinsman redeemer, but instead he was the one who argued against his brother. You have restored relationships and reconciliation, the removal of shame, life restored, shalom, the kingdom of God, vindication, adoption, and inheritance for the righteous versus shame, contempt, and rejection for the wicked. This is honor and shame language. So then within an honor and shame-based culture, what are the consequences of sin? Well, in honor and shame-based cultures, the shame that sin brings affects the whole community. It affects the whole family. Everybody together. You represent by your name your family. So for me, I represent the Whytes family. What I do reflects on the rest of my family. So your name is seen as being important. The community you come from is seen as being important. And if you sin, it is a betrayal or a collective violation of this, where you are bringing now a bad reputation upon your people. So when a member of a people is insulted or offended or attacked, it is as if the whole group is now being targeted. So this is usually when you would see that rising up of the fists and going on the attack if you insult my sister or my brother. This is actually one of the reasons why Japan suddenly turned imperialistic at the end of the 19th century. But anyway, that's a side topic more related to my dissertation. But also when a member of the group does something that is wrong or fails to achieve the goal, the whole group bears the shame of that failure or the thing that they have done.
Sounds like federal headship.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. There is a lot of family headship. And so, for example, before we started, the three of us were discussing a little bit about like different things that the kids got into. So when your son, I believe, Chris, basically wrote those social media posts that seemed like all of that, if this were in an honor and shame-based culture, people would not only look to your son as, okay, you broke the rule, you broke the law, they would also be saying, you, Chris Day, are a bad parent. You have shame. And so you need to deal with that shame. And so because of all of this, the tendency is to hide or to cover up or to avenge that shame, even if what caused that shame is a different opinion or a different conviction or a different life choice. In India, if a Brahmin husband wants to marry a Dalit wife, going across castes, big no-no. Or in the Muslim world, if someone decides they don't want to follow Islam anymore, they want to become a Christian. Or actually, even in the East Asian world, I want to become a Christian. That basically means you are forsaking the family and it's bringing shame, so we need to hide it, we need to push it under the rug, we need to try to change you, we need to try to eliminate the problem. And so to remove that shame and to restore that honor, the offender who is causing the shame, if they are not redeemed or restored into the community, this is where the gospel comes in right here. If this does not happen, they must be removed or canceled. And this happens through various means. Especially prominent in East Asian cultures is suicide. It's better to die than to have my family or my nation face the shame of my failure. This is why at the end of World War II, most of the Japanese soldiers, instead of wanting to become captives, they killed themselves. There's also one of my classmates in my master's degree who also killed himself. He's South Korean because he got a poor mark, and so he felt that it brought shame upon his family. Unfortunately, it left his family behind without him. It's bad, but it plays into all of this. Alternatively, there's also honor killings. For example, killing those who've left the faith for the sake of Christianity in certain Islamic countries. Quite often, it is the family members who would go and kill the person who was offended. But not always. In Iran, for example, it's more the government that will do it because the family members also kind of distrust Islam, but that's another story. Or unmarried pregnant women, or deformed babies. They bring shame upon the family, so therefore it is better to kill the one who brings the shame than to have the shame continually be reminded of the shame. There's also violence or warfare, or as we would call it in the West, terrorism, when the ones who are doing the offending are outsiders. Or we have scapegoating, where the blame is placed, or when certain individuals are mistreated for the collective problems. We have a problem here, and the problem is you. So therefore, we are going to heap everything onto you, and you become the personification of the shame. Or with cancel culture, which is a form of social death, ruination, and excommunication. What is the common denominator in all of these results?
Yeah.
Death.
Amen.
The wages of sin is death. So let's consider then our three views. This is kind of where I get into the conversation and where I can actually say that my presentation actually has some relevance. Universal reconciliation, or universalism, says everyone lives forever, everyone gets eternal life, and the wicked will be restored eventually. It may take a few days, may take several thousand years, but everyone will eventually get in, and we're all happy and good, yay. We have eternal conscious torment or eternal conscious punishment, which is how it's quite often more used in order to try to be more less offensive, if you will. They also say that everyone lives forever, but they would disagree with the Universalists in saying that the wicked will remain in conscious misery forever. Everyone gets eternal life. It's just, what is the quality of that life? Or we have conditional immortality, which says only the righteous live forever. The wicked face death and destruction after judgment. Now, just looking at how I've explored this, it seems fairly obvious that there's one that seems to fit a little bit better than the others. But this being said, there are examples from history in the past where these others have existed. Anselm of Canterbury, for example, with his entire wager, he was operating very much within an honor and shame-based culture context, where if a peasant even so much as insults the king, off with your head. But the king can go burn, murder, pillage, rape everyone in an entire village of peasants, and he gets away with it perfectly fine. That's the way that the hierarchy functioned and worked, and that was the way that the honor within the medieval world functioned. And we often tend to forget that when we are approaching, okay, yeah, Anselm, he said some great things. Yeah, but if you understand him within the context of the world that he was in, this is the picture that he's painting. Also, you do have individuals throughout church history who also believed in universal reconciliation as well as these others. But, okay, that's all the bad news. How is the gospel good news? How can we express the gospel in such a way? What does our gospel say to those who've been canceled or who have been cast out from their families or their groups in shame? Well, first of all, there is this entire notion of adoption and redemption and new creation and a new identity and a belonging to a new family, a new tribe, a new kingdom, where you don't have to worry about the shame of your past. Which, by the way, shame is not only the things that you do to others, but sometimes also what others do to you that causes that shame. Shame is about a broken relationship. What is offered to those who are in Christ is that you're now free from shame and contempt. You're part of this new family, this new tribe, this new kingdom. As well as that, think about the gospel itself. It's a gospel of reversals, isn't it? Those who are shamed by the world are those that are honored by God. God chose the weak things to shame the strong. He chose the foolish things to confound the wise. He chose the things that are nothing, the things that are dismissed, in order to bring to nothing the thoughts of those who place themselves at such high. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 1, the text of my first sermon ever, by the way. But think about just a few examples of this. I mean, how do we start a family who would then go and bless the nations? Hey, I know, let's go find that elderly barren couple that everyone looks down upon because, hey, they can't have kids. Something must be wrong with them. They must be sinning. Or, how about we think about Jesus himself? How he was born? His mom was an unmarried teenager, probably in their mid-teens. Not really the greatest thing in most cultures. As for his dad, well, his dad had a choice for sure. He could have divorced her quietly, kept quiet, and not worried about it. But instead, he chose to marry her, which then transferred her shame onto himself. Now, he's either A, the guy who knocked up his girlfriend before they were married, therefore it's his fault, or B, he's the sucker who married this unfaithful woman who was unfaithful to him even before he was married. And then, even before he's 2 years old, they are chased out of their home country and are forced into another country. So now they are the foreigners, the refugees. And then when he grows up, he's homeless. He's looked down upon by the officials. And then he's eventually abandoned and betrayed by his friends, put in with trumped up charges in a mock trial where he is stripped naked, whipped and flogged within an inch of his life, forced to carry the crossbeam of his death instrument through the city streets as people are throwing things at him and mocking him and yelling all kinds of expletives at him, where he's brought up to the top of the hill where the last of his garments are ripped off of him. He's hung on this tree fully naked. blood everywhere. And then to add to the mockery, this is the king of the Jews. This is what happens to them. But yet, that was what God honored. But as well as that, we usually think about communion as simply we gather together, we take some bread, we drink from a cup as we're remembering the crucifixion. Yes, it is definitely that. But if we're reading it from an honor and shame perspective, there's more to it. See, the church is also described as the body of Christ. And by taking a piece of that bread and eating it, by breaking bread together, we are saying, I'm at peace with you. I belong to you, and you belong to me. So by taking that bread, we're basically saying, I belong to this people. The cup, of course, was Jesus' blood. And that is that the price that he paid is sufficient. It is enough. That's kind of just a side topic here, but it's just something else interesting that I found. But if new creation is described as restored shalom, reconciled relationships where God is rightly honored and glorified everywhere, where even death has been defeated, where all that is wrong has been undone, how does our view of final destiny for those who are refusing the reconciliation, as in our view of hell, affect God's reputation? Well, first of all, we do need to differentiate between the intermediate state and the final state after the resurrection and the judgment and the new creation. But that's already been talked about. So I'm not really going to get into that for today as such. But there are a few other things at least to think about. For one, there is a final separation between the righteous and the wicked in final judgment, where God is vindicated. This is something that you see constantly throughout Scripture. This is something that both eternal conscious torment and conditional immortality agree with. That the end result is separation between these two groups. That seems to be at least as I'm approaching it, I may be wrong. As I said, I'm not a language guy, so I can't really express that as well. But it seems to me, as I'm reading it, that this seems to be the case. But at the same time, the eternally continual existence of a part of creation that remains in rebellion and continues to slander God's name, that is a stain on God the King's honor. And this is something that conditional immortality agrees with universal reconciliation. So here's in some way, each of the different viewpoints can kind of fit at least some of these. My own stance of conditional immortality, I admit that I am rather biased in it, and that may be how I have presented it, but I see that is the one that seems to fit the picture the best. And on that note, thank you very much for your attention and for joining me here.
Yeah, that was great. Before we field questions, what time do we have? What is the time?
That is a great question.
What's that?
It's 1:57.
All right, we might have time for like 2 questions. And unless anybody needs to use a bathroom, they'll have to leave before 2:10.
I was just going to ask, when it comes to collectivist culture, where do you stand on, do you think there's just absolutely no introspection, or do you think that there's just limited introspection compared to individualist cultures? Because when we talk about shame versus guilt, especially in certain cultures, if you do something that you violates some moral code, but you are never caught, you don't feel guilty. The guilt, or at least in some cultures, they don't even feel bad. So the guilt, I think, comes from introspection. There are sociologists who argue that there's no introspection, and others who would argue that there's limited introspection, whereas we seem to all have running dialogues all day long with ourselves. So where do you land on that in the sociological?
Okay, I would say that it depends on the culture, for one. Even when we're talking different culture types, no culture is purely one way or purely another way.
No, but they would say that in guilt cultures versus shame cultures, there's less introspection in general. So are you saying that you would put? But there are some that have argued, at least since like in New Testament sociological studies, like since Stendhal's article about the introspective West,
Okay.
they say no, there's just like Zebra Crook and other context scholars will say no, there was just none, and others would push back and say no, there's some, and so
I would say that there is some,
yes,
but that some is based just as much on what does my family think, what does my
Right.
community think, as much as this was an objective right or wrong.
well, insofar as how would they look at me as a valuable member of the in-group, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
how they, yeah.
Yeah. So there is that as an aspect of introspection, but it's understood from a different point of view, I guess.
Yeah, like they're more outward oriented in terms of their self-identity is how do others esteem me
Yeah.
versus we're encouraged here to think, how do you esteem yourself?
Yes.
You know,
Yeah. And both of those would actually view the others as being highly suspect or highly
Sure.
sinful.
Yeah.
Which is kind of where breakdowns happen.
Well, I agree. I don't buy into the notion that there's zero introspection because I think you can't escape it even when you're outward oriented in your self-understanding by the estimation of others. So
Mhm.
I was just curious where you felt.
And there are also, because within each culture there's actually a mixture of all of these different components. It's just a matter of which one is more dominant.
Right.
Which is kind of also why I said it depends on the culture,
Yeah.
because there may be some cultures that may be very high on or shame, but their secondary component might be guilt and innocence, and they might have a lot of that. Well, there's also these rules that are not.
Yeah, it's on a spectrum.
Yeah.
Whereas ours is
Yeah.
flipped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ours is flipped around to the extent of we've basically forgotten the community, and we've forgotten the family, and we've forgotten the love one another. We're very good on the vertical relationship with God. We're not so good with the horizontal relationships with one another, or with the opposite vertical relationship with the rest of creation.
Yeah.
We in the West are not very good at that. And they would probably say that we don't have very good face or introspection into how what we say or what we do affects our family or affects our community.
Well, that would be reflection. That would not be so much introspection.
Okay.
I have a question about the distinction between contempt and shame. So I read Daniel 12:2, for example, as saying that the resurrected wicked will experience shame, but what is eternal is contempt, which is not what they feel, but rather what those who are remembering them feel.
Okay.
And my question is, and what traditionalists will sometimes push back on that with is the only reason they cared about the contempt was because it would make them feel shame. And I'm curious, based on your experience in more predominantly honor-shame cultures than the West, do people care about how they are remembered after they're gone, even if their family isn't a part of the equation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
They very much care that way, especially Confucianist-based Eastern Asia.
So
you find it in other places too, but it's very prominent there that how you're remembered is seen as of absolute importance.
Or your name.
And that's why.
Yeah, it's your name, it's your family name, but also connected with that as well. Since you did also mention the aspect of the family being included within it, when we go into some of those cultures, highly collectivistic cultures, and we bring an individualistic gospel, which basically says you believe, you repent, and you're fine. Their response is, yeah, but what about the rest of my family? What about my ancestors? Because my ancestors, they did not believe, and what happens to them? And quite often our response to that is, oh, well, they're burning in hell. what's going on in their minds is, these are my honored ancestors, this is my family, this is my identity, this is my community. If everyone else is burning, I get my identity from them. Why should I forsake my family and come over and follow this religion that you are calling me to forsake my family and my culture and my nationality, etc., etc.? And this is why Christianity has, or one of the reasons why Christianity has continually struggled in Asia, particularly.
Very interesting.
But
We probably have time for one more.
There's a plus and a minus there, because if you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, I mean, other than points of contact like in chapter 5, where Paul would say, yeah, even the outgroup thinks that this guy and his father's wife is bad. But for almost the rest of the books, and trying to defend his own ministry in 2 Corinthians, he is trying to show everything that the larger dominant culture says is shameful, despised, whatever, is honorable. He's trying to do that reversal that you talk about almost entirely. And I think that's why in certain Christianity, in certain of these cultures, it's not just enough for Western missiologists to understand honor and shame, but then you have to look at what the biblical text is saying about the amount of effort that Paul is going through to reverse their thinking on what is honorable, what is shameful. And so that itself is, you're asking them to go against what in some cases is centuries of this is honorable, and what you're saying is shameful is what this God you're talking about holds in esteem, which is totally opposite from what. So that's
that is there's kind of two poles that you could see within how Christianity functions within different cultures. Andrew Walls, who's a missiologist in England, he referred to them as the indigenizing principle and the pilgrim principle. The indigenizing principle is, how well does the gospel and Christianity adapt into a certain culture? The pilgrim principle is, how does Christianity challenge the assumptions of that given culture that kind of make it a separate culture in and of itself? And so this is an example of that, where you've got all of these things that Paul is trying to lay out. Okay, you have a great conception or understanding of honor in and of itself, but I'm going to try to point out to you this, what you think is honorable actually is not so much in God's eyes, and this which you consider shameful, some of it, is also shameful in God's eyes, but there's some of it like humility and love and forgiveness and grace. These are things that God actually honors, that he actually loves. And these were things that were looked down upon as being shameful within the Greco-Roman world, for example.
But I still, and I think that learning to communicate those things, because there's obviously context where the Christian worldview, if you want to say, speaks to people. Because if you look at something like Galatians, for example, I would say that the reason why the church was so successful with Jews and further from Jerusalem is because they had to get on with life in Gentiles, so they set more loosely the Torah than if you were living in the land. So when Peter gets to Antioch and the man from James shows up, and he reverts back because they're trying to tell whether you're Jew or Gentile. Antioch, Galatia, wherever, Jews out there were fine not getting service. They wanted to participate in the games and wanted to do all that. But it seems like, so there's places where that message does resonate more, especially if you are an outsider to, like, you find the diaspora Jews who are outsiders to Israel, the Jews in Jerusalem, and are outsiders to the Gentiles too. So that when you talk about the gospel comes in with the despised, so there's a lot of opportunity. Because those, like India, you talk about the caste, there's a whole slew of people that really need to be lifted up, and the gospel has that lifted up, that everything that you are told makes you low, God elevates to be, glorious. So I do think there's like a lot of opportunity. So even though we can talk about what we get wrong in these cultures, there's a lot of opportunity for the gospel to speak to many people in those cultures.
I say amen to all that.
And with that, I think it's a good time. Let's give Reverend here a great job.